Barron Trump, just 19, marched into court to defend his family's image, accusing Jasmine Crockett of defamation. But in front of cameras and a nation holding its breath, she flipped the script and shattered his case in seconds. Jasmine exposed everything before millions in a way Trump never saw coming. So what did she say that made Barron the one guilty all along? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The federal courtroom was bursting, every seat filled, every breath heavy. Flash after flash, exploded microphones shoved forward, the entire nation watching live. All eyes locked on two figures, Barron Trump and Jasmine Crockett. The tension was electric, the silence before the storm. This was not just a trial, it was spectacle. Barron, only 19, strode in like a conqueror. His suit crisp, his smirk sharp, his presence radiating arrogance. He was the plaintiff, claiming Jasmine had defamed his image, his honor, and his political future on national television. To him, this was not about justice, it was about dominance. He turned the lights, catching his cold stare, and faced her directly. Jasmine entered with quiet strength, no fanfare, only a few loyal aides. A congresswoman from Dallas, steady and unshaken. Barron leaned forward, his words slicing the silence. "Who are you to dare come at me today? Is the end of you." The judge's gavel slammed down. The duel had begun. The gavel had barely finished echoing when Barron's attorney stepped forward and pressed a button. The lights dimmed, and a giant screen lit up for everyone in the courtroom to see. A video started playing, cut and spliced in sharp, deliberate ways. On screen, Jasmine Crockett was shown mid-shout, her arms slashing through the air, her voice raised. The same 5-second clip replayed again and again, making her look furious, unhinged, completely out of control. The lawyer's voice boomed over the images. "This is who Jasmine Crockett really is, hot-tempered, reckless, completely out of control." Gasps filled the courtroom. To people watching at home, it looked damning. The murmurs grew louder as the video kept rolling. One clip showed Jasmine slamming her hand on a desk, but her words were chopped up and twisted. A bold caption filled the screen. "Barron Trump hides behind his last name, using it like a weapon to gain influence." Pulled out of context, it came across as a personal insult, not just to Barron, but to the Trump family name itself. The camera zoomed in on her angry face. Without the full speech, she looked wild, unstable, unfit for office. A few people in the gallery laughed out loud. Others shook their heads in scorn. Reporters' pens scratched furiously across their notepads. They knew these images would lead the headlines. At the prosecution's table, Barron leaned back with ease, arms crossed, a smirk curling on his lips. The video froze on Jasmine's face, mid-yell, finger pointed like a dagger. The silence in the room was heavy. Then Barron rose slowly, savoring the moment. His voice sliced through the air. "This is the congresswoman who dared to insult me, a desperate attention seeker, nothing more than a third-rate actress." His words were sharp and cruel, and whispers erupted across the chamber. Some spectators laughed outright, their voices bouncing off the marble walls. "She looks insane," one muttered. "Unhinged," said another. For a moment it looked like Barron had won the room. The video had done its work. It painted Jasmine as unstable and desperate, a politician willing to attack a 19-year-old heir, just to grab attention. On live television, the story was already shifting. Barron was the victim, Jasmine the aggressor. News tickers flashed on monitors in the press section, Crockett exposed as unstable. Did she defame Barron Trump? Cameras snapped in rapid fire, capturing Barron's smug grin as he stared down Jasmine like a man enjoying victory. His supporters whispered with glee, convinced the trial was tipping their way. The judge tapped his pen and called for order, but the scene was already spinning out of control. And still Jasmine didn't move. She didn't bow her head or flinch at the mocking laughter. She sat tall, hands folded, her eyes locked on Barron with calm intensity. She wasn't shaken. She wasn't broken. She was waiting like a fighter, biding her time before striking back. To most of the room, she looked cornered. But to those who truly watched her, it was clear Jasmine Crockett was steady, coiled, and ready. This round belonged to Barron. The battle, however, was only just beginning. And then through the storm of whispers and laughter, Jasmine rose. "Your Honor, permission to respond," she said, her voice steady, yet edged with fire. The judge gave a curt nod. She stepped to the lectern, a small remote in her hand, her posture unshaken. What you saw was a fabrication. Now you will see the truth. The lights dimmed once more, and the screen flickered to life again, not with jagged edits or flashing captions, but with a single unbroken reel. The entire courtroom leaned forward, the tension snapping tight. On the uncut footage, Jasmine was speaking to a crowded town hall, her tone fierce but focused. Families drowning in medical debt, factories closed, children left behind by a broken system. She said her words raw and unpolished but anchored in reality. There were no sneers about Barron, no cheap shots at his family name. The damning caption from before Barron Trump hides behind his last name, using it like a weapon, was nowhere to be found. In its place was a pointed critique of injustice, not of a teenager. She was indicting power itself, not a single boy. The distortion had been laid bare. The room gasped. The gallery, which moments ago jeered at her, now sat frozen. One reporter whispered to another, "That line isn't even here." Another shook his head, scribbling furiously, "Prosecution footage exposed as doctored." The shift was palpable. It was as though the entire courtroom had been slapped awake. Barron, once smirking, now stared at the screen with a twitch in his jaw, his arms uncrossing, his knuckles whitening on the table. Jasmine seized the silence. She paused, the video turned to the judge, to the jury, and finally to Barron himself. Her voice cut through the air. "Yes, I am angry. Angry because people are being neglected. That is a strength, not a sin." The words reverberated like a war drum. Every syllable landed heavy, undeniable. It wasn't chaos, it was conviction. The gallery erupted in scattered applause before the bailiff barked for silence. Even as the judge raised his hand to restore order, the echo of clapping lingered, rebellious and alive. For the first time, Barron's mask slipped. He leaned hard into his lawyer's shoulder, whispering fast, his eyes darting like a cornered fighter. The bravado was gone. In its place was something rawer, thinner fear, bleeding through the cracks. Jasmine clicked the footage forward, 30 more seconds of her speech playing out in full context. Again, no mention of Barron, no insult, no personal attack, only a relentless focus on wages, housing, and justice. What the prosecution had spun into rage was clearly righteous anger. What they had sold as instability was the heartbeat of conviction. The entire narrative, once so carefully engineered, collapsed under the weight of truth. When the lights came back on, the courtroom was transformed. Jasmine lowered the remote and sat down, her face calm, almost serene. The air was heavy, electric, every person in the room aware they had just witnessed a reversal that would ripple far beyond those four walls. Barron's easy victory had dissolved in an instant, and in its place a new story was writing itself, one where the supposed victim looked like the manipulator, and the woman accused of fury stood revealed as a fighter of unshakable resolve. The courtroom was still buzzing from Jasmine's stunning counter when the heavy oak doors creaked open. Heads turned sharply. A man in his early 50s walked in wearing a rumpled gray suit and clutching a sealed envelope like it was radioactive. The clerk announced his name, Daniel Whitaker, former White House communications aide. He had served under 2 administrations, and his sudden appearance sent a jolt through the room. His hands shook as he placed the envelope on the clerk's desk. The silence was suffocating. The judge motioned for the bailiff to bring it forward. The envelope was slid open, its contents spread across the bench. The top page carried a stark heading in bold Operation Silence. The words seemed to pulse under the fluorescent lights. Whitaker cleared his throat, his voice rough but steady. This document details a coordinated digital smear campaign against Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. It was designed, approved, and circulated within the Trump political circle. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The judge ordered the first pages projected onto the big screen. Each bullet point appeared in black and white, pay high-profile social media influencers to brand Crockett as angry, unstable, and unfit. Launch anonymous Twitter accounts to spread doctored video clips portraying her as out of control. Flood Facebook groups with memes mocking her district as corrupt and chaotic. Push hashtags including Crockett meltdown and unstable Jasmine during her live appearances. Coordinate fake op-eds to appear in online outlets, framing her as dangerous to national stability. Whitaker's voice cracked as he continued. "I left the administration when I realized this wasn't just politics, It was targeted character assassination. The goal wasn't debate, it was to erase her credibility and silence her voice. His words hung in the air like a confession. The plan wasn't speculation. It was orchestrated, deliberate, systematic. Then came the blow that shattered the room. The judge flipped to the last page and stared. "There's a signature here," he said gravely. The document was projected for all to see. At the bottom of the approval form in bold ink was Barron Trump's name and signature. The chamber exploded into chaos. Shouts, gasps, and camera flashes tore through the silence like gunfire. A reporter yelled, "It's his own handwriting." Another screamed into a phone, "Get this on the front page now!" The gallery buzzed like a hive, disbelief and outrage colliding in waves. At the prosecution's table, Barron went rigid. The arrogance that had carried him through the morning drained from his face. His lips pressed thin, his eyes darted wildly, whispering frantically to his lawyers. But nothing could erase the projection above him, his name tied directly to Operation Silence. The hunter had become the hunted, and everyone in the room knew it. The uproar over the signed memo had barely subsided when Jasmine's lead attorney stood holding up a small flash drive. His voice rang out above the noise. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, we will now present the accompanying audio evidence." The judge nodded grimly, and the bailiff carried the device to the clerk. The lights dimmed, and a single speaker hissed to life. A hush fell across the courtroom, as if the entire chamber was holding its breath. Then came the voice, Barron's voice, crisp, unmistakable, echoing through the speakers with chilling clarity. "We have to silence her. If we don't, she's going to tear this family apart." The words were directed to his father, Donald Trump, the two of them caught in a private exchange, now blasted in public. The effect was immediate, like a hammer smashing glass. Gasps erupted, hands flew to mouths, reporters froze mid-sentence. The sentence replayed once more, and the words seemed even heavier the second time. For a long beat, nobody moved. Even the judge seemed momentarily stunned. The sound of Barron's voice lingered in the air, impossible to deny, impossible to ignore. A murmur rose from the gallery, frantic and disbelieving. One man whispered, "That's his voice. That's him." Another muttered, "He admitted it." The cameras clicked in a furious rhythm, red lights blinking like alarms. What had been whispers of suspicion now solidified into the weight of proof. Suddenly, Barron leapt to his feet, his face flushed crimson. He slammed his hand on the table and shouted, "This is a setup. This recording is fake. It has no legal value." His voice cracked with fury, desperation, spilling into every syllable. His lawyers tugged at his sleeve, urging him to sit, but the outburst only made the room buzz louder. The gallery reacted with shock, some shouting back, others jeering. Barron's fury no longer looked like strength. It looked like panic. The judge's gavel cracked against the bench, silencing the noise. His eyes narrowed as he fixed Barron with a piercing stare. "The legal value will be decided by this court," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "But what is clear, abundantly clear, is the truth in what we just heard." The words dropped, heavy, final, carrying more weight than the gavel itself. Barron's defiance faltered, his lips pressed thin, his eyes shifting to the floor. The energy in the room flipped. Just moments ago, Barron had played the victim. Now exposed by his own voice, he looked cornered, diminished, the architect of a smear campaign laid bare before the world. Jasmine, seated calmly at her table, did not move, did not smile, did not gloat. She simply watched, steady and unblinking, as the tide turned. The balance of the trial had shifted, and everyone in the chamber felt it. The hunted and the hunter had just changed places. The moment the audio ended, America convulsed. Phones buzzed, televisions cut into live feeds, and one headline blazed everywhere: Barron Trump's Operation Silence exposed. Anchors spoke with clipped urgency, their voices shaking as the memo and signature filled the screen. The footage replayed in endless loops, Barron's own name tied to a plot meant to destroy Jasmine Crockett. The nation was stunned. The lie had detonated in real time. Markets bled instantly. Stocks connected to the Trump empire slipped red, the tickers flashing like sirens. Analysts muttered about a collapse of trust, while brokers whispered of contagion. Outside the courthouse, the crowd swelled into a roar. Homemade placards stabbed the air, chants rose like thunder. "Justice for Jasmine. Justice for Jasmine." The noise rattled the glass doors as police struggled to hold the line. Inside, silence smothered the chamber. Barron sat stiff, sweat beating his temple, his hand trembling against the table. The swagger of the morning was gone, his smirk replaced by a pale mask of dread. He stared at the projector, as if willing it to vanish. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett sat unflinching, her eyes cold steel. The storm outside echoed inside, the air was unraveling, and the fighter had never looked stronger. The roar from the leaked memo still rattled the chamber when Jasmine's attorney rose again, a single folder gripped tight in his hand. His eyes swept the room, his voice sharp enough to slice through the tension. Your Honor, we now present authenticated metadata from Barron Trump's private correspondence. A ripple moved across the gallery. The bailiff took the folder, handed it to the clerk, and within seconds the overhead projector came alive. The audience leaned in the silence so heavy it hummed. On the screen, the metadata appeared in stark black and white: sender Barron Trump. Recipient Mark Hastings, Senior Communications Advisor. Date February 14th, 11:47 p.m. The timestamp glowed like a scar seared into the record. Then below it, the words that detonated the courtroom. If necessary, I will use money to crush Jasmine Crockett. The room gasped as one. It wasn't rumor, it wasn't gossip. It was proof, his words, his account, his timestamp. Reporters shot to their feet, yelling into phones, pounding keys, snapping photo after photo of the projection. The gallery buzzed in disbelief, some clutching their mouths, others muttering, "He wrote it himself." The chain of command was now undeniable. Barron had not only approved the smear campaign, he had ordered it. The silence lasted only seconds before Barron erupted. His chair screeched backward as he shot up, slamming his palm on the polished table so hard the microphones rattled. "This is all a conspiracy against my family," he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of desperation. His face flushed red. His eyes darted from the jury to the judge to the flashing cameras. "This is fake. This is an attack," he barked, spittle catching the light. His lawyers grabbed at his sleeve, whispering frantic instructions, but he tore his arm free, raging at the courtroom, as though volume alone could erase the words on the screen. The spectacle might have swallowed the room whole, but Jasmine rose before it could. Slowly, steadily, she stood, her eyes locked on Barron. She raised her hand, finger extended, cutting through the chaos with a single unshakable gesture. Her voice rang clear, strong, merciless. Honor does not come from threats. It comes from truth. The words struck like a hammer blow. For a beat, the chamber froze. Then it erupted, not in whispers this time, but in thunder. Applause crashed against the walls. Cheers rising despite the bailiff shouting for order. People stood clapping, pounding their palms together, the release of a crowd that had just witnessed the mask ripped away. The judge pounded his gavel, the sharp cracks echoing like gunfire. At last the chamber stilled, though the energy still trembled in the air. His face was stern, his voice heavy with finality. After reviewing the evidence, he declared this court dismisses the case. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett is not guilty. The gavel fell once more, the sound reverberating like thunder through the building. Cameras exploded with flashes, reporters screamed into phones, and the gallery gasped. Barron Trump slumped back into his chair. His face drained sweat dripping down his temple, his smirk long gone. Jasmine remained standing tall, unshaken, her eyes forward, like a blade of steel. The hunter had become the hunted, and America had just watched the tables turn live. The thunder of the judge's gavel still echoed when the world outside the courtroom caught fire. Within minutes, international newsrooms pushed breaking alerts. Headlines blazed across screens, from London to Sydney: Barron Trump lawsuit, a crushing defeat for America's most powerful dynasty. Anchors spoke with a mix of shock and fascination, rolling clips of Jasmine Crockett standing firm, pointing her finger, her words burning into history. Honor does not come from threats, it comes from truth. On split screens, Barron's sweat-soaked face replayed again and again, his roar of denial looping like a confession. What had begun as a family's attempt to muzzle a critic was now framed as a global spectacle of power undone. By the next morning, legal blogs and think tanks had seized the moment. Professors across the country rewrote their syllabi overnight. Law schools from Harvard to Georgetown announced that this case would be dissected in classrooms as the prime example of strategic lawsuits against public participation, better known as SLAPP suits. Students young and eager were told they would study not only the evidence but the tactics, the weaponization of courts to intimidate opponents. One professor went live on CNN and declared, "This is what happens when privilege mistakes silence for victory. The law is now our shield against it." His words echoed in lecture halls, carried into podcasts, and lit up social feeds. The Crockett case wasn't just a headline, it was a textbook written in real time. The impact shook Washington too. On Capitol Hill, murmurs became motions. Lawmakers who had long avoided the subject now found themselves cornered by public outrage. Hearings were scheduled in record-time debates called late into the night. The target was clear, a sweeping anti-SLAPP bill meant to stop the wealthy and powerful from burying critics in endless lawsuits. C-SPAN broadcasted the fiery exchanges as senators sparred. One stood and said, "We cannot allow our courts to become the playground of billionaires' children. Justice belongs to the people, not to dynasties." His words drew applause from the gallery, a rare sound in the Senate chamber. The urgency was undeniable. Congress was moving because the nation demanded it. Meanwhile, the streets themselves became a stage. From New York to Los Angeles, rallies erupted. Protesters carried signs painted in bold strokes. "Justice over power, you can't buy silence." "Truth wins." Outside the courthouse in D.C., the chants thundered day and night. "Justice for Jasmine! Justice for Jasmine!" Police lined the barricades, but the crowds kept swelling. Ordinary Americans, turning sidewalks into rivers of defiance. At one rally, an elderly veteran held up a flag and shouted, "I fought for this country, not for kids with last names to own it." His words were caught on camera, replayed across the networks, his voice becoming a symbol of the moment. The movement seeped into homes, workplaces, churches, and bars. Conversations buzzed at dinner tables and coffee shops. If a 19-year-old heir could try to silence a congresswoman, what would stop anyone with money from silencing a citizen? Talk radio lines flooded with callers demanding reform. Editorials thundered with one refrain: "Justice must stand above privilege." Even late-night comedians joined in their monologues, sharp their punchlines, brutal, their audiences roaring with recognition. The Crockett case had transcended the courtroom. It had become America's new line in the sand. And so the tide of public opinion surged unstoppable. The Trump name, once shield and weapon, now dragged like an anchor. Jasmine Crockett, once the defendant, now stood as a symbol of defiance that even international media could not ignore. In Europe, newspapers compared her to whistleblowers who had rattled empires. In Asia, commentators called her the voice that power couldn't silence. Around the world, the message was clear: America was drawing a line. From the Capitol Dome to the city streets, from law school halls to living rooms across the globe, one truth reverberated louder than any chant, headline, or gavel strike: justice must stand above power. When the chants finally thinned and the cameras blinked to black, the reckoning left the courthouse and walked straight into private lives. Barron Trump vanished from public view, canceled appearances, shuttered accounts, and let his phone ring to voicemail. Neighbors said the blinds stayed closed for days while a security SUV idled like a sentinel at the curb. Old classmates messaged reporters with the same refrain: he had always been the quiet one, the kid who sat in the back and sketched logos in the margins. Now they said that quiet had curdled into a symbol power gone astray, the phrase bouncing from podcasts to headlines like a verdict no jury could overturn. Some voices softened, arguing the 19-year-old had been pushed onto the front line too early, his father's orbit turning pressure into oxygen. A former teammate remembered him whispering, "I'm tired of being a last name before practice," then laughing it off like it cost him nothing. A family friend told a late-night host, "He is a kid in a dynasty suit," and the audience sighed because it sounded too believable. Think pieces arrived within hours, weighing nurture against power, inheritance against agency, and tragedy against choice. But beneath the pity ran a harder note, a drumbeat that grew louder every hour. Most people were not confused. They repeated one sentence until it swallowed every excuse: he signed it. He signed the approval, he sent the instruction, he tried to buy silence with influence, and there was metadata to prove it. Talk radio callers hammered the line: accountability starts with the hand that writes, and the host let the silence after it do the work. Editorial boards that had once tiptoed around dynastic scandal now wrote without tremor, calling the plan a tutorial in arrogance and fear. Barron's disappearance read not as reflection, but as damage control, the vacuum of leadership that follows when the mask finally cracks. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett moved in the open, not triumphant, but tireless, her schedule stacked with invitations she never asked for. Universities booked her for keynotes, unions asked for town halls, and civil groups requested workshops on how to fight lawfare without losing your voice. On stage, she kept one theme steady: courage is for everyone, she said, the line landing like a hand on a shoulder. Panels introduced her as the woman who stands up to power, and the phrase stuck because it was simple and it fit. Footage of her steady stare at council table rolled beneath conference spotlights, a loop that turned composure into a kind of anthem. Two images began to haunt the country: a pale air sweating under courtroom lights, and a congresswoman carved from resolve. One sank from view in absence that said everything. The other stepped into the noise and made it orderly. Parents mentioned it at dinner, pastors used it in sermons, bartenders nodded at televisions when the segments ran again. America loves a comeback and fears a cover-up, and this story offered both cutting straight to the bone of what power is for. By week's end, the narrative had sorted itself with brutal clarity. One path spiraled into silence. The other turned pressure into purpose, and the nation, still breathless, could not look away. In coffee lines and subway cars, strangers traded the same two sentences like passwords. He disappeared because he could, and she stayed because she had to. A muralist painted Jasmine in profile with the caption, "Stand Up," while across town a gallery hung a blank canvas titled Inheritance and left it unsigned. Podcast hosts replayed a friend's old memory. He was gentle, but he never said no to power, and the clip ricocheted through feeds until the nuance wore thin. At a leadership summit, the moderator introduced her with 7 words: a woman who stands up to power, and the room rose before she said a thing. By then, the story felt settled in the country's bones, one figure fading into the safety of silence, the other stepping forward with the dangerous clarity of someone who refuses to blink. It haunted the nation like thunder after lightning, loud, undeniable, impossible. To forget a pairing that replayed whenever screens lit up and conversations turned truly serious. The crack of the gavel still echoed like thunder when the trial officially ended, but the echoes did not stop at the courtroom walls. The crowd sat stunned for a breath before the wave of noise returned. Reporters shouting questions, cameras firing in bursts, the buzz of history being written in real time. The bailiff called for order, but it no longer mattered. The verdict had been delivered and the balance of power had shifted before the eyes of the nation. The trial was over, but the story was only beginning. Barron Trump left first, though few noticed. The boy who had entered as plaintiff now walked as a shadow, his face pale, his head bowed, his once polished shoes dragging across the marble floor. There were no statements, no smirks, no victory speeches. He moved quickly, flanked by lawyers, slipping out through the rear exit into the cold night. The cameras caught only fragments: the hunched shoulders, the clenched jaw, the look of a fallen heir. Commentators later said his silence was louder than words, an image of privilege shattered under the weight of truth. Jasmine Crockett emerged next, not rushing, not triumphant, but steady, her steps measured against the roar of the crowd outside. Microphones were thrust toward her, questions screamed over one another. She raised her hand for quiet and spoke simply. "This is not my victory. This is the victory of justice." The words rolled over the mob like a tide, repeated, amplified, carried into the chants of those gathered on the courthouse steps. There was no gloating in her tone, no revenge in her eyes, only the fierce clarity of someone who understood the fight had been larger than her alone. Outside the building, the effect rippled instantly. Cable networks switched to live coverage anchors leaning forward, their voices hushed but urgent. Congresswoman Crockett frames the verdict as a win for justice, not herself, one announced, as if narrating a chapter in a civics textbook being written in real time. Editorial boards moved quickly, publishing late-night columns that thundered for reform. Headlines screamed, "Justice over privileged courts belong to the people, power on trial." What had begun as a lawsuit to silence one voice now set fire to a national conversation. On Capitol Hill, the reverberations landed like tremors. Lawmakers who had whispered in hallways now stood at podiums calling for an anti-SLAPP bill to shield journalists, whistleblowers, and public servants from predatory lawsuits. The hearings filled quickly, testimonies televised, senators declaring, "The courts cannot be the playground of billionaires and their heirs." The case had become ammunition for reform, its details dissected line by line in congressional debates. The gavel that freed Jasmine Crockett had struck the first blow of legislative change. Across the nation, the people seized the moment. In classrooms, teachers replayed the footage, students debating what it meant for democracy. In coffee shops, strangers leaned across counters, trading the same refrain: justice had stood taller than money. Churches echoed with sermons about truth over fear, and barrooms clattered with toasts to courage. The case had pierced something deep, the belief that even the smallest voice armed with truth could shake the walls of a dynasty. And in the swirl of commentary, one message emerged: as education, as warning, as creed. The law is not a weapon for intimidation. Judges repeated it in op-eds, activists printed it on placards, parents reminded their children. Another truth followed close behind: power does not come with privilege. It comes with responsibility. Young people debated it in forums, their posts carrying the spark of a generation no longer willing to bow to names alone. And the final lesson, the one that stung and inspired alike, was repeated until it etched itself into the public consciousness. Even the smallest truth can shake the tallest empire. That night, the last image seared into history was not of words but of contrasts. Jasmine Crockett walked down the courthouse steps into a sea of outstretched hands and lifted signs, the crowd chanting her name until the noise became thunder. She did not wave, she did not dance. She simply stood shoulders square, steady as the symbol she had become. At the same moment, down a back alley, Barron slipped into a waiting SUV, swallowed by the shadows. The cameras caught only a glimpse, enough to etch the divide in the nation's mind. One figure lit by the roar of support, the other disappearing into silence. And as the lights faded, one question lingered in every newsroom, every living room, every corner where the trial had been watched: when truth rises, who among us can still hide? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything, like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.